Hey there, friends. I hope that you enjoy this episode of the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast as much as I enjoyed making it. I want to take a moment here at the beginning to extend a special offer, an invitation to you, our dear listeners, to join the Remembering course. Our next start date is going to be in middle of March. This is a powerful, deeply moving, and for many people, transformational experience into the heart of colonization, climate change, family histories, ancestors, and so many other critical intersecting pieces. Just visit our website, Sequoia Samanvaya. All the information is in the link below.
Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. My name is Sara Jolena Walcott, and I am your hostess on this sacred learning journey of unraveling, unveiling, and becoming more fully alive at the end of the world as we know it. In this podcast, we offer up to you, dear listener, 3 forms of episodes to support your journey of remembering and reenchanting. First, conversations with amazing people. Second, storytelling. And third, myth casting. In this episode, we're going to bring you a conversation between myself and another amazing, fascinating leader in the areas of remembering and reenchanting. In our Remembering and Reenchanting podcast today, I'm delighted to be welcoming Robin Cook Roth. Robin Cook Roth is the CEO of Tradecraft, a longtime fair trade activist, and greatly enjoys walking pilgrimages and Quaker processes. Traidcraft is the original fair trade pioneer in the UK. The movement of radical church-based individuals began by importing goods directly from artisans and growers from over 30 developing countries and distributing them directly to shoppers in the UK, cutting out the middlemen over 40 years ago. The team collaborated with their growers and artisans throughout the process, and over time came to know the needs, dreams, and ambitions. They subsequently co-founded the Fair Trade Foundation and helped to establish the standards that underpin today's well-recognized fair trade mark. Robin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
This conversation and the impetus for this conversation came about in large part because a number of friends and I who have sort of ongoing conversations, and friends who are working in different faith communities, and all of us are working around climate change, we're talking about the organizational challenges within the organizations that we are facing, that we are working with often. And the need for different kinds of organizational structures. And your work in bringing Holacracy to your organization came to the fore. It was mentioned as one of the people who is in our network who has been doing some interesting work. So I'm very curious, Robin, if we can actually just sort of start with, how did you come to Holacracy in your work as a CEO? And how did this shift your sense of the organization?
I suppose, like most people in any form of management, in a mission or purpose-driven organization, you're constantly looking to see if you can be better at fulfilling your mission. And the first time I encountered self-management was actually not with Traidcraft, but with the organization I worked for before, which was also a fair trade company, just happened to be in Germany. And I came into contact with some very interesting consultants who, without really telling me that it was holacracy, started to introduce me to some of the ideas of self-management and how organizations which have a mission need to drive themselves rather than be driven from the management structure. So that was my first encountering of it. In the company in Germany, it didn't work for a very simple reason. The overall management structure didn't want it. And that's one of the first lessons I think I learned with self-management, that if the current boss or the management structure object to it or don't want to implement it, then nothing will happen. Even if the people in the organization were desperate for it, in that traditional management structure, nothing happens until power is released or relinquished. And I think we'll come back to the question of power a lot. When I got to Traidcraft, I was the only CEO, so I had more authority to do what I felt was appropriate, and that's when I really engaged with the idea of self-management.
So can you say a little bit about what self-management means for those of us who are less familiar?
Yes, so self-management is really what it says on the tin. It means that organizations don't have traditional hierarchies. Nearly everybody thinks that businesses or organizations can only work with some kind of hierarchy because that's the way we've been trained and we've grown up. And particularly older people, I find, are completely wedded to the idea of someone at the top, a couple of people below them, a few more people below them, and then at the bottom, the people who do the real work.
It's people over the age of 50?
Yeah, people over the age of 50. And whenever I give talks, I can recognize the look on the faces of precisely this demographic when I start talking about self-management. And the first reaction is, that will never work. That couldn't possibly work. And there's a kind of shutting down. And the other reaction you get from that kind of demographic is, well, actually, I'm a brilliant boss. You know, I'm really good. I let people do what they think they need. I'm very supportive. That's a real red flag. That kind of boss is often the worst kind of boss. And we'll come back to it.
And just I think I know what you're talking about. I'm curious, why do you find that person is often inaccurate in their self-perception?
Well, I think if you were to ask anybody at any stage of their career how many outstanding bosses they have had, you'll see this kind of thought process go across their face, and they'll screw up their eyes and say, well, you know, there was somebody once who. But if you ask the opposite question, how many dreadful bosses have you had in your life? It's kind of, well, there's this guy and that woman and this person, and it just reels off. Most people do not understand how bad a manager they are. And again, that comes back to power. Power, in my experience, is tasteless if you are exercising it. If you are receiving the consequences of someone else's power, it stinks. And it's this imbalance between power exercised and power experienced that I think defines why so many people have no idea how poor their management abilities are. And I include myself. The reason I felt self-management was good for me was because I appreciated I wasn't actually the perfect boss to all people, and nor can you be.
And some level that just it's not that people are particularly bad people. It has more to do with like how do we share power?
That's right. I mean,
how is power exercised?
I'm sure we've all had one or two bosses who were probably on the scale of psychopathic or mean or bullies. You know, that exists, and let's not pretend it doesn't. But actually, it's understanding power that is at the real heart of this. The ability to define for yourself what you need to do on any given day is very, very important. And if that is overwhelmed by someone else's decision that actually you need to be doing something else, that's very disempowering and very ineffective. And you asked a moment ago, what is self-management? Well, it's a very, very difficult, complex area. But actually, if we boil it down to a few little stories, it becomes suddenly much more comprehensible. And the story that I like to tell best of all is from the founder of Holacracy. And Holacracy is just one type of self-management. It's not the only type. It's not necessarily the best. Happens to be the one I know because it's the one I implemented. But he remembers telling an experience when he was learning to be a pilot. He was flying on his solo flight on his own in an airplane, having done all the lessons. And he was given the task of taking off and landing in an airport somewhere. And he took off and everything was perfect. He knew exactly what he was doing. He had all the knowledge in his head. And he noticed that on his dashboard, a little flashing light started clicking on and off. And he had no idea what that little red light meant. It was one of those things on the periphery of his vision. He'd never really had to study it because it didn't seem important. And he made the decision with all that he knew. He had enough fuel. All the other instruments seemed to be working. On the basis of what he knew, he decided to carry on. And the story ends with him almost causing an international incident by landing in a storm without radio contact at an international airport, because that small flashing light was telling him something that he himself didn't understand. And his insight into this was, in any organization, you need to make sure that every flashing light is being observed by at least one person who understands it and who has the authority to say to the organization, this is critical, we turn back now. The smallest red light, that someone has the authority and that person has to understand it and they have to be responsible for it. And that helped him get to this point of saying, if you truly distribute power amongst the people, then the people have to know exactly what it is they are doing, what the limits of their power are, and what authority they have. But if you do that properly, then you don't get into the kind of difficulty that many organizations do, which are led by one person who believes they understand everything, but in fact don't always spot the red lights.
What you're talking about here is not really quite the same as complete equality between all people within the organization, so much as very clear roles and responsibilities, each of which has power.
Yes, I think this is a real misnomer about self-management. Self-management does not mean equality. It means clarity and clear distribution of power as appropriate. You will always, in any organization, have people whose roles, and the word role becomes very important in self-management structures, because you don't look at people as individuals, you look at them as people who exercise various roles. Some roles are always going to be more important than others. For example, the role of making sure that the accounts are filed according to current legislation once a year is a very important role. It can't be done by everybody. It needs a certain skill set and it needs to be rewarded appropriately. The role of picking a product in a warehouse and putting it in a box is very important, but it doesn't carry the same weight in terms of the whole thing. So let's get away from equality and let's think about appropriate distribution of power with clarity about who can do what.
So then who decides what's the appropriate distribution of power? Because that seems like that becomes a very big question in this context.
And there are various ways of running self-organizing or self-management systems. All of them have to decide at the beginning who has ultimate power. Now, in a traditional organization, that power is invested in the CEO or the board or some person. And that's where that power is. It's very clear. The boss decides. So what happens if you say, actually, no, we're not putting it in a person, you have to put it in something else. And there are various options. One of them is to invest it in principles. So you define at the beginning very clearly, these are our core principles. And then every decision ultimately has to be measured against those principles. Now, if you look at most modern democracies, the other version you have is it's invested in a law. So ultimately, you make laws and everybody has to obey the law, even the lawmakers, which in America and Great Britain at the moment is questionable. The version of self-management that I used was that you invest in a constitution. You don't invest in a principle. You don't invest in certain laws. You invest in a pre-written constitution that tells you how to sort out your problems. And the constitution doesn't give you the answer in advance. It says, these are the things that have to be obeyed in order to make decisions. Now, at this point, it all gets a little bit abstract, and people think, well, how on earth can you make decisions against a constitution? The constitution's in the background. In fact, you don't really refer to it very much, just as in the way living your normal life, you don't refer to the American Constitution or the German Constitution. In Britain, we don't even have a constitution. And the way it works is that there are very, very, very clear rules about how you come to decisions, and you obey those rules. It's kind of a constitution boiled down to its core essence. And one of the great things, one of the huge advantages for me in self-management was the efficiency of meetings. I could talk a lot about this, but I think all of us know and recognize organizations, particularly mission-driven organizations, where the meetings go on for hours. Everybody gets to speak and nothing is decided. I think we all know that kind of environment. I am not exaggerating when I say that in our holacratic meetings, you can process up to 20 or 30 items on an agenda. Plus, you can go through all the project updates from the past week. Plus, you can check in all your KPIs. And the average meeting will last less than 20 or 25 minutes. And how does that happen? It happens because there are incredibly strict rules about who speaks when, and more importantly, who doesn't speak. And Holacracy was very, very good at saying, it's not your time to speak. It's not your role, it's not your authority, you've got nothing to say. And one of the things about power is that if you give power to somebody, you have to trust them to do well with that power. So I'm jumping around a little bit. I get quite excited when I talk about self-management because it works so well and so efficiently.
And it sounds very, very efficient.
It's incredibly efficient. Yeah. And as CEO, was CEO, at the end I wasn't CEO because I gave up that role or that position. I did not always know what decisions were being made. Now, most bosses at this moment would, just put their hands over their eyes and they'd give that scream. But actually, that's true in most businesses. Most businesses, the boss has no idea what's going on. None at all. They think they do. They give their directives, they send out their emails, but what actually happens on the ground, they have no idea. And stuff gets done without them knowing. People go around the system, it's just the reality. The lower down the organization you are, the more you know that that's true. The difference is, I knew that the people who had to make the decisions were making them, and that they were making them from a position of clarity. I don't need to know what products were being bought to clean the toilets. Why on earth would I? But the person who had that role knew exactly what they had to do and were doing it well. So it does require a lot of trust for a CEO to give up that kind of power. You have to trust in the system, not in people, and that's the difference.
Were there, let's kind of go back to let's tell a little bit of the story of the transition that you went through, because I think that might kind of help bring some of the things you're talking about into some of the particular. First of all, I'm very curious, when you sort of first talked about this idea with your employees, was there any initial resistance or skepticism?
So I did have the advantage that at Traidcraft, we had to almost reboot the company. We got into financial trouble, which was why I was brought in. So we started from a point of desperation in a way. And I think when people are aware that the whole system is about to break, they're open. And you really do need openness for Holacracy. What helped me was a wonderful book called Be More Pirate. Be More Pirate is a study of piracy in the 18th century. and how ships that were effectively run by outlaws had to make up rules for themselves, because they weren't subject to the British maritime law and they weren't subject to French or American law. They had to make up their own rules. And so these communities of outlaws created very interesting structures and very interesting management structures. And you have to understand that on pirate ships, there were multiracial, or a lot of freed slaves were involved in piracy. They had women, they had children, and they wanted to ensure that all of these communities were represented equally. And in fact, some of the first social security systems were invented on piracy terms. You know, if you lose an eye, then you get so many pieces of silver. If you lose a leg, yeah, very interesting. It's much more serious than the title begins. So I encouraged everybody to read this book, and it was fun. It was fun. And we felt that fair trade, or any mission-driven organization, actually is it's a bit about piracy. We're trying to break the system, or we're trying to do something different, or break the rules, cause good trouble. So there was a great energy at the beginning. And I think without that energy and without that commitment, it's very, very hard to take people from the security of a known hierarchy and put them in something completely new. My experience in doing it was that the younger the people were, the quicker they got it. The older the people were, the more doubts, the more insecurities, the more difficulty they had in letting go. That's not an absolute. Some of the older people were brilliant. Some of the younger people were more shy. And overall, with self-management, the theory books tell us that about 20% of people really just don't want it. They can't go. They actually just want to come to work, do a job, not be asked to get involved, get their pay and go home. And that's fair enough. You know, that's fair enough. But if you're in a mission-driven organization, you tend to have people who are more engaged in the work. So the beginning was easier, I think, than it is for many people. I didn't have to overcome management inertia because there wasn't one. And I had a lot of people who were keen to do something new.
And was there much reorganizing of the structure of the organization itself?
Yeah, completely. We started from scratch. And the wonderful thing about self-management is that the organization is treated like an organism rather than a static object, and it develops itself. So the organogram of Traidcraft changed every week. Now, if you feel that's scary, it's probably because you're used to a normal hierarchy where you have every 3 or 5 years some major restructuring. We've all been through it, where management consultants come in. You go through this horrible process of redefining jobs and roles, and then a new organogram is produced, and then it gets put in a folder, and then 5 years later, the whole process starts again. And between beginning and end of the process, the organization develops or doesn't anyway. Self-management, and particularly Holacracy, allows you to change the organogram after every meeting, and you record the changes. New roles emerge, old roles disappear. Some roles get more responsibilities, others have responsibilities taken away. And there is software associated with this whereby you can, a bit like Google, you can type in a word like toilet paper, and every time the word toilet paper has been used in any given decision, it's recorded, and you can see who's responsible for buying it. And that's obviously banal, but more interesting. Price lists, that's a really good one in most businesses. Usually there's an almighty fight about who's allowed to change a price list. But Holacracy or self-management says we invest this role with that authority to produce the price list. It's clearly recorded. If I want to amend a price, I can't. I have to go to the role that's responsible. So did we have to change the structure? Yes, almost every day. That isn't scary. It's actually organic. It's how the human body works. It's also how cities grow. When you think about it, most businesses get more cumbersome as they get bigger. Cities get more efficient as they get bigger. It's worth thinking about that. And it's not because cities are centrally driven by one person. It's because communities develop, people see needs, they fill the need. a community of houses is built, a shop moves in, a church moves in, a pub moves in, an old community starts to die out, the houses fall down, the shops move out. It's very organic. People move to where the need is and fulfill the missing gap.
Mm.
And the whole thing about self-management, it's driven by an awareness of what's not working. That's what you're doing in meetings. You're talking about gaps, filling them, and then you get on with your work.
As you've been describing this, I keep thinking of a book that I've been working on and will be doing an additional podcast on at some point in the near future, about it's reviewing. It's called A New History of Humanity, The Dawn of Everything. Have you heard of it?
But that sounds like the kind of book I would love.
It's by David Graeber and David Rengro, who are anthropologists and archaeologists, and they're kind of like re-looking at human history. And one of the things that they point out is that that there's a myth that arose actually in large part because of the American indigenous critique of Europe. There was a myth that arose because the indigenous critique of the indigenous critique of Europe was very strong. And it was like, why do you organize yourselves in ways that are so hierarchical? Why are you not free as people? This was what they were saying to Europe. And the Europeans took that on initially. They started critiquing themselves and wondering if they should change their society, especially sort of the more what I think we might now think of as the bourgeois elite before that term was so popular. And 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 several relatively young economists began saying, no, 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 we don't want to go down that path of freedom. We don't want to go down that path, which is really a much higher level of self-organizing of governments, because you see that the indigenous people, the Indians over there, are poor. So there's a sort of notion of wealth and poverty that was also a very big part of this conversation. But it was also organized, is how people were organized and then how they were experiencing material wealth and material poverty. All these sort of critiques were integrated together. And that includes, the role of women, and indigenous women in America had, 5-10 times more freedom and power than than the women in Europe did at that time, and which was quite scandalous, especially for many of the Jesuit missionaries. But this was actually kind of interesting. We laugh about it. It was interesting in part because the critique that the Jesuits had actually had to do with the role of God in society. So if God is the reason why you are obedient to your superior within the context of an abbey, for example, is because that is part of how you're learning how to be obedient to God. Whereas in the indigenous American Haudenosaunee systems and many others in Huron and Lenape, the way you demonstrate, the way you came to know your relationship to the divine was an internal process. And so you would not learn. I don't even think they would use the word obedience to God, but let's just say faithfulness. You would not learn faithfulness through subjecting yourself to another. That would be ridiculous, because that other is not where God lies. God is not. This is the divine. The sense of all beings is much more relational, and it's much more. There's a much more intimate sense of creation, and whatever you're doing, you're not necessarily going to subjugate yourself to another person. And so this basic threat was so threatening to Europe that those who kind of pushed back against it, they kind of made up the story of history. And the story of history that they made up was that the human societies went from what they saw and they called indigenous American primitives. So this what they thought of as small bands of hunters and gatherers, and small scale farming, which was not actually a fair description of most indigenous American societies at that time. But they sort of created this story of going from small bands to towns to agriculture to city-states to nations and to empires. And that the actual human history is completely not that. We did not start out only as small grands, or if we did, that was a really long time ago. And we have gone up and down with various types of scale and various types of organizing. And agriculture did not precede cities necessarily. There were many cities that did not have agricultural as a significant part of their economic organization. But very critically, one of the key aspects of being human is our ability to make decisions together. It's actually our ability to govern ourselves. And for much of human history, we've gone back and forth between many different types of governing systems, sometimes within the same year, sometimes within the same culture. And one of the questions that the authors ask is, how did we become so stuck in one form of governance, which, as you're pointing out, dominates both most corporate and organizational culture, as well as dominating many of the ways in which we govern these larger political bodies as well. Like we see some of these basic structures of governance in both the cities and larger governance, as well as within the organizational space. And I think part of what I'm curious about is, I think about like the extent to which we have forgotten how many different forms of governance humans can have. It's also like, where do you see like the role of people's sense of spirituality, or people's sense of the relationship to all of creation? And I want to say that very loosely, because I know you're working with people from a wide range of faith traditions, as any organization, most organizations do. So like, what is the role of this sense of power as it relates to spiritual powers displaying itself in an organization?
I mean, that's a really interesting analysis or description that you just given, and I think I'll come back to your question, but just my comment is, of course, most people are fascinated by mega corporations which make huge amounts of money and assume that that's the best form of governance because it seems to be the most profitable. And you can understand why people, assume top-down hierarchy works because it makes money. But that's also precisely the problem in some way, that they're there to make money, not to nourish any sense of purpose or spirituality. So that's not the paradigm that you want if your mission or your personal desire is for work to be part of your spiritual life. I don't think most people go off to a mega corporation to nourish their spiritual life. They go for material purposes. So if you want to step back from that paradigm and see work as part of a spiritual life and different forms of being together in community. I mean, there's another management theorist called Frederick Laloux, whose famous book is Let My People Go Surfing, which captures the biblical let my people go with the California dream of more time and freedom. And there is a whole movement of organizations that are exploring again, going back, as you described it, going back to other forms of governance. Why did they do it? Because actually most workers are fed up and they're not nourished by that old hierarchical system. And you only have to look at your own organizations. How much money do we spend on consultants who develop, what do you call it, employee benefit systems? You can have your Fridays off, you can have a duvet day, you get a bonus, you can bring your dog to work, whatever it is. Millions and millions of ideas, all trying to kind of put a patch on the core problem, which is most people are not involved in the power thing. It's the power at the heart of the organization.
I would put a number of even the more contemporary mindfulness and meditation kind of folks going into corporations and teaching mindfulness, but most of them are not actually getting to power redistribution.
No. And unless you do, the management consultants come, everyone has the workshop, they feel great, and 3 days later it's the same old rubbish with the same old boss with the same old problem unresolved. So it's just sticking plasters. Unless you deal with the core issue of power and governance, which means someone has to give it up and others have to pick it up, you don't get very far. You just get into this cycle of frustration. And you and I know that the incidence of burnout in mission-driven organizations is much higher than in corporates.
Mm.
Because in corporates, they know why they're going to work. They're going to get the money.
Right.
In mission-driven, you go because you believe in it, and you still get the same dreadful management systems. People burn out, they get frustrated, and they go, and it's horrible. These are good people, and they deserve better. Let My People Go Surfing is, I think, is a wonderful title. Yeah, and I'm really not here to preach about holacracy. There are many, many ways to manage organizations through self-management systems. You can explore many different options.
There's many threads there that you're saying that are of interest, and I think what I'm wondering right at this instant is, how was it for you to give up power, to relinquish power, and what have you gained in that process?
It is the most wonderful experience that you can imagine.
Mm.
Most CEOs are scared, nervous, very insecure, desperately needing reassurance. It is a wonderful thing to be able to say, we have a structure here where other people know better than me what they need to do today in the name of the organization. I'll give you a lovely example. We had a young man join us as a graphic designer, and we introduced him to the concept of self-management. And one of the rules is, if you self-manage, you manage your time. And if someone comes to you with a request, you can always come to another role with a request. You have the right to say, no, I can't do that at the moment because what I've got on my plate is significantly more important, self-management. He got hold of this very quickly. In a week after he joined, I actually went to him and asked him to provide me with a deck of slides for a talk I was giving. And he said to me, I can't do that this week. I have something that's more important. He didn't tell me what it was, but he'd got hold of this principle. He knew what he needed to do. I was slightly taken back with my traditional CEO hat, but I thought, no, let's go with it. Let's see where it takes. And it turned out he did, in fact, have something much more important than my deck of cards. He had to get a flyer out to shift a whole load of stock in the warehouse that was causing me a cash flow problem. He was the last link in a chain of really important work. He had a deadline of that night or a couple of nights later. He had to get this graphic out. We had to email it out. A whole team of people had been working on it. He got on with his job. He did it. I can't say particularly that it saved the company, but it certainly was important he did it. And looking back afterwards, I'm thinking, yeah, he knew much better than I what he needed to do. I could have played the CEO card and said, hey, I'm the boss. You do what I want now. And it would have been to the detriment of the company. And that, I think, is a lovely example of, by giving away power, the company profits, the company benefits. And he was empowered. I mean, he flew after that because, you know, he could say, yeah, Robin came and asked me for this, but I knew I had it. Really, you could see him just blossom as a colleague, and my relationship with him just went up a couple of notches. There was a great deal of respect for him and he for me, because we respected each other's authority. What's it like to give up power? Unbelievably liberating, as long as you have the right structure and systems to ensure that that power is well used. So you don't want to go into something like this on the hoof and make it up as you go along. That way will lead to disaster. You want to make sure you plug into one of these many self-management systems that has been introduced, tested, refined, rebalanced, and brought back again and again and again, because actually the whole idea of holacracy is that it's a community-led piece of software that gets better and better with experience. So that's a really big piece of advice. Just don't pretend you can do it on your own. You'll come unstuck very quickly.
Right. I mean, part of what I'm hearing is that it's not relinquishing power into a void. It's relinquishing power into a different system.
That's exactly right.
And I suspect I'm actually thinking about how that relates to other aspects of relinquishing power, just in the overarching work of decolonization. That often I think that is sort of the anxiety: is what if one is releasing power, what is it going into? What is it's like where is the ball going? If you're gonna give away your balls, where are they gonna go? And sometimes I don't think we always need to know the answer to that question, but what I'm hearing you say is that in the context of sharing power within and coming to different power relations within the context of a company and a organization, is the importance of really being clear what the structures are.
Yes, I think a lot of people listening might think, well, that does sound a bit anarchic, and you're giving up power and it's just going to seep away. I cannot stress enough how structured holacracy is.
Mm-hmm.
There are rules upon rules upon rules about how you make decisions. And if you do not follow them, the system will unravel. So it's completely the opposite of anarchy. It's like a game of football or any sport. When you see really high class sports people play a game of football or rugby or tennis, you have no idea what they're doing and how they're doing it. But what they are doing is an ingrained understanding of the rules and how to play within the rules.
And there's a lot of rules.
And there are a lot of rules. If you try to read the rules of football and then went out and played a game, you won't be able to do it.
There are so
You
many
actually,
rules.
yeah, there are some rules. You learn by doing it, and you
Mm-hmm.
learn by having a referee.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, a very integral role in holacracy is somebody called the facilitator, who is a member of staff who takes on that role in meetings. But they have to know the rules and they have to implement them, and they are completely neutral in any given situation. They
And
just
so they're
make sure
acting like a referee in some ways.
yeah.
And
And
they're not outside facilitators coming in. They're people from within the organization.
to begin with, I think it's very advisable to have outside facilitators coming in, because at the beginning, meetings can be very heated. People will react in ways that they're used to reacting, which is shouting or being bullying or dominating or undercutting or being snide or sarcastic. None of that behavior is permitted, and it is slapped down publicly and clearly, but also neutrally. So to begin with, you do need outside facilitators. But one of the great parts of learning the process is that after a while, people believe they can do it. And that's great growth for people to facilitate a meeting and do it well and get through 30 points of order in half an hour. You come out of that feeling very good.
Mm-hmm. And what happens in those instances where one disagrees with or doesn't get along with a coworker? How does that what's the sort of the process for coworkers
So
having challenges together?
challenges happen in every organization.
Mm-hmm.
We know that. So if you to step away from self-management, how is that dealt with in a traditional organization? Well, you have a complaints procedure, you have a grievance procedure, you have human resource procedure, you get meetings and letters, and all of that may be right and good. In self-management, you decide as an organization how you want to deal with it. And you may end up copying that same kind of process. You may have organized meetings between people. You may have a role called a grievance role or whatever. The point is that there isn't a predefined answer to that question. But because you're managing yourself, you follow the rules and create the structure that you feel is appropriate to deal with that issue. And the same is true of pay. Who decides who gets paid what? Holacracy does not say, if you do these roles, you get that amount of money. No, it says, these are the rules you need to follow in order to create the structures that you believe will give you the right answers. It's very unsatisfying sitting from the outside to hear that, but actually it works very well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And does to what extent does that extend? So as you know, you're based in the organization is based in the UK. It has an international global supply chain. You're working with farmers and suppliers from many different parts of the world. Uh, how does this organizational structure intersect with your suppliers?
This is a really an important question. And if you want to transfer it to an NGO, how does an internal structure like that deal with funding organizations or governments? Or how do you deal with the outside world who doesn't understand and is possibly not that interested? Well, if you're dealing with other organizations with a similar spirit or intent, you can become quite inspirational.
So I was wondering, I would imagine many of your suppliers would actually be quite interested in,
oh yes,
in your
organization,
in what's
I
happening.
mean, many of our suppliers are involved in the Commonwealth economy, circular economy, that kind of world, the biodynamic economy. People who already think beyond the normal envelope. So they're open to it. The problem is more when you're dealing with non-aligned organizations. And very often you have to develop a role called translator. That's what we do, where you have someone who explains to the outside world what's going on the inside, acts as an intersection. And often you need someone to do that, or several people, because it's a culture war, and people can get frustrated with you if they don't understand your processes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the role of translator between organizations and entities as part of what it means for people to shift into to shift larger social aspects feels very important.
It is a critical one. It's not the most important at the beginning. To begin with, you have to sort your own stuff out. And it's a process that is heated and often, I wouldn't say violent, but it's quite common in the early days for people to slam doors, walk out in tears, shouting, saying, I don't believe in this anymore. This, I'm not getting what I want. And that last statement effectively captures it all. They're having to learn the discipline of the rules of football, and picking up the ball and running it with their hands is not part of the way it's played. As you mature as an organization, this intersection element becomes very important. And trying to explain to the outside world what you're doing in a way that doesn't sound freaky or arrogant is very important. Very important. It's not with the aim of trying to convert anybody else. It's with the aim of trying to help people understand a different way of ticking and working, and why some things may be slower or quicker than they would normally expect.
I'm curious about to what extent has this shifted your own sense of spirituality and your own sense of what does it mean to work as a spiritual person?
It has. There's no question that I was attracted to this process because of my interaction with the Quaker movement, where decisions are made by consensus, not consent. You're never trying to get everyone to agree, but you're trying to find a way forward that everyone feels is appropriate or can live with. That's a really important principle. Personally, I think I've become a great deal more reflective. And I tend to listen now, because I'm not allowed to make decisions myself and get what I want. You genuinely do listen. And listening is a very important part of any spiritual journey. And I love the Quaker advice and query, consider that you may be mistaken. And I have been proven time and time again in my business dealings in the last few years. I've had to acknowledge again and again and again that the decision I would have taken would not have led to the same good result as the one that other people knew they needed to take. And if nothing else, you just learn to step back and stop trying to be the answer to everything and learn from others. And I think those are all very profound spiritual lessons, quite in contrast to the obedience dictate that you were describing earlier, as the way that most hierarchies, impose spirituality. You do what the father says or the priest says. That's not where I am at spiritually. So I have found that this way of working chimes much more profoundly with a spiritual way of thinking and encourages it. So work becomes part of your spiritual life.
Which it is. We spend tremendous amounts of time working. Most of us do. And so we need our work and our capacity to grow as people, to be deeply connected.
Amen to that.
And connected to a culture and a climate and an environment that needs this, that needs people to grow in wisdom in their understanding and in their capacity to make decisions together.
Yes, I think it's fair to say that the people who have embraced this way of working, they have grown phenomenally. We don't have one-to-ones or management meetings because there's no management. There's no, how are you doing? What you observe is just people blossoming. And I occasionally get the comment, we can't really leave here because, where on earth would we go to have the same sense of empowerment? Am I really going to go back into a normal structure and have to listen to some quote idiot unquote boss tell me what to do when it's clear he or she doesn't know anything about what I need? It does create a sense of community. I must stress, not for all people. Some people just do not blossom in this at all, and that's hard but true. But for those who embrace it, it's revolutionary, and I wouldn't say it gives them a spiritual life, but it gives them a sense of purpose that they otherwise wouldn't have had.
And I think I really appreciate linking this for purpose driven organizations, and that particularly I think includes social impact investors and faith, as well as faith communities and artist communities and educational, like new initiatives towards new educational structures, which are drawing people often who can be very independent.
Yes.
And have a wild imagination, which is exactly why they're drawn to the work, but can make, finding the structures of working together is not always easy.
I think that's a perfect analysis. Absolutely spot on. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, it's challenging, and I see a lot of fractions and a lot of people just creating 2 or 3 or 4 people teams, instead of really kind of going for the larger organizational structures, which have so many benefits to them as well in terms of like creating shifts in society.
Yeah, if we're supposed to be part of mission-driven organizations, the most important thing is the mission, not the organization. And the organization is only there to serve the mission. If it isn't, then you're back in the old hierarchy system where it's the wrong way around.
Right. And so we need processes and structures that can actually serve missions.
Absolutely. Absolutely right. That's what it's all about. Yeah.
So if people, if our listeners and others want to be exploring more about how to shift their own organization or how to bring this to organizations that they're working with, what are some initial steps and resources? You've mentioned a couple books already, which we'll put in the show notes, but I'm wondering if there's anything else that you would recommend.
I think there are a lot of very, very good management consultants out there now, advisors who understand the world of self-management. I know one system and I like it, but I think if I had more capacity, I'd learn about others. It's not something you want to implement on your own on the back of having read a book. And indeed, if you read the book Holacracy, which I did, you won't understand a word. It's like reading the rules of football. You think, what? How does this work? So you need to connect into other organizations that are doing it, other people who have had experience, and you want to find the kind of consultants or advisors who have a breadth of knowledge on this. And you need to invest. You need to invest in educating yourself before you start launching something that goes off wrong.
Mm. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm really hearing that some of this investment is experiential learning as much as possible.
Absolutely right. When you've actually sat through, there are two types of meeting in Holacracy. One is called tactical, one's governance. Once you've sat through these two meetings, which focus on the work that needs to be done and roles and responsibilities, and you see how people do it, it is like watching high-class football or rugby or tennis. You marvel at the speed and the efficiency. And it's quite different from going out onto a field with a ball and trying to copy it yourself. You can only fail if you do it on your own. You can only be inspired when you're with and experience it with other people who know what they're doing.
And just as there is, national and international football leagues, are there leagues of self-management organizations that people can go and learn from and seek,
So here in Europe,
players?
here in Europe, we're quite lucky because a lot of self-management started in Holland,
Mm-hmm.
and
With
I think
sociocracy, yeah.
yes, that's exactly right. There's a lot of companies doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And you tend to find that companies doing it are very open and willing to inviting you in.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like rocket science or highly secretive. So you have to go looking for them. Just type in self-management companies and you'll get a list and just phone around. That's what we did. We had a few conversations with companies that were there, and we listened to their advice and then probably ignored most of it. We tried to do too much on our own. You want to get some professional trainers in to begin with. It saves you so much time, but there are great communities out there on the internet that you can find and plug into.
And do you have favorite organizations in California?
I don't know anybody in California, I'm afraid. I'm this side of the pond. Though I think one of the world's largest, is it Azos? No, Zappos. Is an Holacracy-driven company, and very, very interesting organization, and a relatively large organization. But no, I'm afraid I'm not that well networked.
Well, I will send you some if I find them.
Yes, please do.
All right. And is there any other kind of concluding words of wisdom that you would like to, or questions that you would like to leave with people today?
I think the question that I always like to leave is not with people who are thinking of introducing Holacracy, but it's the question to the people who traditionally manage businesses, the CEOs, who, when they encounter this kind of thinking, tend to respond with there is no way that could work. And the kind of question or challenge is, do you really believe that the system you've got is the perfect and the best one? Or is it worth exploring? Maybe just exploring some of this cutting edge stuff and seeing if any of it would be of interest. You don't have to go the whole hog. There are many, many stages, but it's good to challenge ourselves. We don't have all the answers, and that's the kind of question I would leave hanging. Could it be done better? And the answer is always, yes, it could.
Thank you. Thank you for the humility that you bring to this work, and the willingness to not only be wrong, but to find different ways of being better.
Thank you.
Yeah, and to embrace that diversity of being that comes along with these kinds of changes, internal and external. Thank you so much for joining us from Germany, and I look forward to being in communications with you and others, and there will be many ways for our listeners to find some of the resources that Robin has been talking about, and all that will be on the show notes. And I look forward to hearing from people about what resonates in this conversation and what are their next set of questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and reenchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Summit Via website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarajolena.com.